After the Louisiana Purchase doubled its size overnight, America had a new problem, one it would spend the next 60 years failing to solve. Every mile of new land raised the same explosive question: would this territory be free, or would it belong to slavery? For decades, American leaders tried compromise after compromise to hold the country together. Each one bought a little more time. None of them solved anything. This is the story of how a growing, ambitious young nation slowly tore itself apart, one uneasy compromise at a time, until there was nothing left to compromise over. They believed it was their destiny to fill this entire continent, coast to coast. They rarely stopped to ask who was already living on the land in between. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the United States, a powerful idea took hold across the young nation: that it was America's destiny to expand across the entire continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Settlers pushed west in growing numbers, drawn by the promise of open land and a fresh start. Explorers mapped new territory. Towns and farms sprang up across regions that, only years earlier, had belonged to no American map at all. But this expansion came at a cost that boosters of manifest destiny rarely mentioned. Every mile of new territory was land that native nations had lived on for generations, and every new state raised an old, unresolved question that would only grow more dangerous with time. Would this new America be a land of freedom, or a land where slavery simply kept expanding alongside it? They thought they'd solved the problem. Thomas Jefferson, watching from retirement, knew better. By 1819, the United States was evenly split: 11 free states, 11 slave states, and Congress had maintained a fragile balance of power between them. When Missouri applied to join the Union as a slave state, that balance, and the peace it preserved, was suddenly at risk. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to settle it. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine would enter as a free state to preserve the balance, and a line would be drawn across the remaining western territories. Slavery permitted below it, prohibited above it. It worked for a while. But Thomas Jefferson, retired at Monticello, wrote privately that the crisis had struck him like a fire bell in the night, a warning of something far larger still to come. He was right. The Missouri Compromise didn't resolve the question of slavery's future in America. It only postponed it, and every new territory added to the map would eventually reopen the exact same argument. They had homes, farms, schools, and a written constitution of their own. None of it was enough to stop what came next. As American settlers pushed further west, the government moved to clear native nations off land it wanted for expansion. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forced relocation of Native American nations from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast to territory west of the Mississippi River. Between 1830 and the following decade, tens of thousands of Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were forced from their homes and marched hundreds of miles west, often with little food, shelter, or medical care. Thousands died along the way from exposure, starvation, and disease, a journey the Cherokee themselves would come to call the Trail of Tears. It stands as one of the darkest chapters of America's westward expansion, a reminder that the growth celebrated as manifest destiny came at a devastating human cost to the people who were already here first. "Remember the Alamo" became a rallying cry for a war that would hand America nearly a third of a continent, and handed a problem it wasn't remotely ready for. In 1836, American settlers in Texas declared independence from Mexico, and after a brutal siege at a mission called the Alamo, ultimately won their freedom. 9 years later, Texas joined the United States, a move that helped trigger the Mexican-American War in 1846. By 1848, the United States had won a decisive victory. The peace treaty handed over an enormous stretch of territory that would become California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other future states, nearly a third of modern-day America in one stroke. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it reopened the exact wound the Missouri Compromise had tried to close nearly 30 years earlier. All this new land raised, once again, the one question America still hadn't answered: would it be slave or free?
Take a look at this, I found it!
Gold brought a flood of new settlers to California almost overnight and forced Congress into its most fragile compromise yet. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, triggering a massive rush of settlers hoping to strike it rich. Within 2 years, California had enough population to apply for statehood as a free state, which would upset the delicate balance in Congress once again. The Compromise of 1850, engineered largely by the aging statesman Henry Clay, allowed California to enter as free, but included a harsh new Fugitive Slave Act, requiring citizens and officials in free states to help capture and return escaped enslaved people, even in states where slavery was already illegal. For many in the North, this law made the reality of slavery impossible to ignore any longer. It wasn't distant anymore, playing out instead on their own streets. For many in the South, it was a necessary protection of property rights guaranteed by law. The Compromise held the Union together for a few more years, but each side now trusted the other less than ever before. A novel moved millions of Northern readers to tears and outrage. A single vote in one territory turned into open warfare between neighbors. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel depicting the brutal realities of slavery. It became a massive bestseller across the North, deeply shaping public opinion and hardening Northern resolve against slavery's expansion. 2 years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers in those new territories to vote on whether to permit slavery themselves, a policy meant to ease tensions in Congress. Instead, it triggered a rush of pro- and anti-slavery settlers into Kansas, each side determined to win the vote by any means necessary. The result was several years of violent clashes between armed settlers, a period so brutal it earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas. It was, in many ways, a preview in miniature of the war the entire nation was now hurtling toward. Compromise, once the tool that had held the Union together for decades, was no longer working. Increasingly, both sides were preparing not to negotiate, but to fight. One man sued for his own freedom and lost in the highest court in the land. Another man decided the courts weren't going to solve this at all and picked up a weapon instead. In 1857, an enslaved man named Dred sued for his freedom, arguing that years spent living in free territory should have made him a free man. The Supreme Court ruled decisively against him, declaring that Black Americans, free or enslaved, could never be citizens of the United States, and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories at all. The ruling shocked and outraged the North, convincing many that the political system itself was now rigged in slavery's favor, beyond the reach of ordinary compromise or debate. 2 years later, an abolitionist named John Brown led an armed raid on a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a mass uprising against slavery. The raid failed, and Brown was captured, tried, and executed, but his willingness to use violence for the cause turned him into either a martyr or a terrorist, depending entirely on which side of the growing divide you stood. By 1859, it was becoming difficult to imagine any peaceful path forward left at all. He hadn't even taken office yet, and already a state had decided it would rather leave the country than accept him as president. By 1860, the country was more divided than at any point in its history. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without campaigning to abolish slavery outright, only to stop its spread into new territories. For much of the South, that promise alone was enough. Within weeks, South Carolina declared it would leave the United States entirely. 6 more southern states followed within 2 months, forming the Confederate States of America, a new nation built explicitly around the protection of slavery. 60 years of uneasy compromises. The Missouri Line, the Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska, Dred Scott, had all been attempts to hold 2 increasingly incompatible visions of America together under one flag. By early 1861, that project had finally, formally failed. All that remained now was to see whether those 2 visions could still be reunited by force, or whether the United States, barely 80 years old, was about to come apart for good. 60 years, America had grown from a young republic hugging the Atlantic coast into a continental power stretching to the Pacific. But every mile it gained pulled at a single thread it had never actually resolved: the question of who counted as free and who didn't. Compromise after compromise had bought time. None of them had bought a solution. By April 1861, time had finally run out. That war, the one that almost ended America before it had even finished becoming itself, is where our story goes next. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to World We Know and join us as we uncover the stories that shaped our world. Until next time, keep discovering history.